I was young and reckless, fresh out of college, with no plan and no money to speak of. Hitchhiking had always seemed like a romantic notion to me, a way to see the country for free and meet interesting people along the way. I had heard all the warnings, but I shrugged them off. Bad things happen to other people, not me. At least, that's what I told myself. I was about halfway through my journey across the country when it happened. I had hitched rides with a few decent people, truckers, retirees, and even a group of backpackers headed to a music festival. Everything had gone smoothly, which only boosted my confidence. That was until I found myself stranded on a desolate stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere. It was late afternoon, and the sun was starting to dip toward the horizon. I had been walking for what felt like hours, and my legs were killing me. There hadn't been a car in sight for miles, and the endless road stretched out ahead, disappearing into the dusty, barren landscape. Then, as if out of a dream, I saw it. A beat-up old car, slowly creeping down the highway. It was the first vehicle I'd seen in hours, and without thinking twice, I stuck out my thumb. The car rolled to a stop beside me, the engine rattling ominously. The driver, a middle-aged man with greasy hair and an unkempt beard, leaned over and opened the passenger door. "Where you headed?" he asked, his voice rough and gravelly. "West," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "As far as you're going." He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes hidden behind a pair of cheap sunglasses. Something about him made me uneasy, but I was too tired to care. I needed a ride, and I wasn't about to pass this one up. "Get in," he grunted. I hesitated for a split second before climbing into the passenger seat. The inside of the car smelled like stale cigarettes and something else, something sour that I couldn't quite place. I told myself it was just my nerves and buckled my seatbelt. The man didn't say much as we started driving. The silence between us was thick, broken only by the occasional cough or grunt from him. I tried to make small talk, asking him where he was headed, but he gave vague, one-word answers. His eyes never left the road. As the sun set and the sky darkened, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. There were scratches, deep, jagged marks on the inside of the passenger door. I tried to dismiss it, thinking it could have been from an animal or a previous owner, but the sight of them made my stomach churn. We had been driving for about an hour when I realized I had no idea where we were. The highway had turned into a narrow, winding road that seemed to lead deeper into the wilderness. The landscape around us had changed. Trees loomed on either side of the road, their branches casting eerie shadows in the moonlight. "Hey," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "Where are we going? This doesn't look like the main highway." The man didn't answer. He kept his eyes on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The car picked up speed as the road became more treacherous, winding sharply through the dense forest. "Seriously, man," I said, louder this time. "Where are we going?" He still didn't respond. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I knew I had to do something. I reached for the door handle, but it didn't budge. The door was locked, and no matter how hard I pulled, it wouldn't open. "Let me out," I said, my voice shaking now. "Stop the car." He ignored me. Panic surged through me as I realized I was trapped. The man's face was stone cold, his jaw clenched as he drove faster and faster, the trees whipping by in a blur. I grabbed at the window controls, trying to roll it down, but nothing worked. "Let me out!" I shouted, banging on the door. Suddenly the man spoke, his voice low and menacing. "You should have kept walking." I froze, my blood turning to ice. I could barely process what was happening. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out, but the car was speeding down the narrow road and the trees were closing in around us. There was no escape. Then, without warning, the car swerved off the road. I screamed as we crashed through the underbrush, the car jolting violently as it barreled through the woods. Branches scraped against the windows and the tires skidded over the uneven ground. The car came to a sudden stop in a small clearing, the engine sputtering before going silent. For a moment, everything was still, and the only sound was the pounding of my heart in my ears. The man turned to me slowly, his sunglasses glinting in the moonlight. "This is where you get out," he said, his voice chillingly calm. I didn't wait for him to say anything else. I lunged for the door again, and this time it opened. I scrambled out of the car, my legs shaking as I stumbled onto the forest floor. I didn't look back, I just ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I didn't care. All I knew was that I had to get away from him. The branches scratched at my face and arms as I tore through the forest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The trees seemed endless, and every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent a fresh wave of terror through me. I could hear him behind me, his heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush. He was close, too close. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right behind me, closing in. Finally, after what felt like hours, I broke through the trees and stumbled onto a road. I looked around wildly, but there was no sign of the man. I was alone. Shaking, I collapsed onto the side of the road, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I didn't stop moving until I flagged down a passing truck. The driver, a kind old man, took me to the nearest town. I never saw the man from the car again, but I'll never forget his words. You should have kept walking. That night, I learned that some roads shouldn't be traveled, and some rides aren't worth taking. I haven't hitchhiked since, and I never will again. It was the summer of 1998, and I was on my way to a friend's cabin in the mountains. The drive was long and winding, with stretches of isolated road that snaked through the dense forests. I'd been driving for hours, and as the sun began to set, I started feeling the weight of exhaustion settling in. The road was deserted, not a car in sight for miles, and the dimming light made the trees seem to close in around me. That's when I saw her. She was standing on the side of the road, her thumb out, a small backpack slung over her shoulder. She looked out of place, young, no more than 20, with long dark hair that framed a pale, delicate face. She wore a simple dress that seemed out of time, like something from the 1960s, and the expression on her face was one of quiet desperation. I hadn't planned on picking anyone up. I never did. It was too risky. But something about her stopped me. Maybe it was the isolation, the thought of her being stuck out there with no one around, or maybe it was the way she looked at me as I passed, her eyes wide and pleading. Before I even realized what I was doing, I slowed down and pulled over. She hurried over to the car, her movements almost graceful despite the urgency. "Where are you headed?" I asked, leaning out the window. She smiled, a small, sad smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Up the road," she said softly. "Just a little further. Thank you for stopping." Her voice was soft and almost melodic, and I found myself nodding before I could think about it. She climbed into the passenger seat, and I noticed how cold the air inside the car felt as she settled in. It was midsummer, but the temperature seemed to drop the moment she closed the door. We drove in silence for a while, the road winding deeper into the forest. The sun had disappeared completely, leaving only the faint glow of the moon to light the way. The trees loomed on either side, casting long shadows that flickered in the headlights. After a few minutes, I glanced over at her. She was staring straight ahead, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face pale in the dim light. I cleared my throat, trying to break the silence. "So," I said, trying to sound casual, "where are you headed?" She didn't respond at first. She just kept staring out the windshield, her expression distant. "Home," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm going home." Something about the way she said it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that was creeping over me. It was just a hitchhiker, I told myself. Nothing more. But as we continued driving, the feeling grew stronger. There was something off about her, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The way she sat so still, barely moving. The way the temperature in the car felt unnaturally cold despite the summer night. She turned to look at me, and for the first time, I saw something in her eyes that made my blood run cold. They were wide and dark, almost too dark, like bottomless pits. "Please," she whispered. "This is where I get off." I didn't argue. I pulled the car over to the side of the road, my hands trembling slightly as I put it in park. She opened the door and stepped out into the night without another word, her movements slow and deliberate. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at her. She stood by the side of the road, her back to me, her figure illuminated by the headlights. The cold air from outside rushed into the car, chilling me to the bone. Then, without turning around, she walked into the woods. I watched her disappear into the darkness, her pale figure fading into the shadows of the trees. I sat there for a long time, the engine idling, my mind racing. Something about the whole encounter felt wrong, deeply, unsettlingly wrong. I decided to leave. I didn't want to stay on that road any longer. I put the car in drive and sped off, glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing in the middle of the road again. But she wasn't there. It wasn't until a few miles later that I saw the house. It was an old, dilapidated farmhouse set back from the road, the kind of place that looked like it had been abandoned for years. The windows were broken, the roof sagging, and the paint was peeling from the walls. And standing in front of it, barely visible in the moonlight, was the girl. My heart nearly stopped. There was no way she could have gotten here before me. I had driven straight, no stops, and yet there she was, standing in front of the house, her face turned toward me, that same sad smile on her lips. I hit the gas, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I sped past the house. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just drove, my heart racing, my mind reeling. It wasn't until I reached the next town that I finally pulled over, my hands shaking as I parked the car. I needed to clear my head, to make sense of what had just happened. I walked into a small diner and sat down, still trying to shake the lingering feeling of dread. I must have looked shaken because the waitress, an older woman with a kind face, asked if I was all right. "I'm fine," I lied, my voice trembling. "Just had a strange encounter." She nodded, as if she understood. "What happened?" she asked. I hesitated, unsure of how to explain what I'd just experienced. "I picked up a hitchhiker," I said finally. "A girl. She said she was going home, but something wasn't right." The waitress's face paled, and she glanced over her shoulder before leaning in closer. "Where did you pick her up?" she asked quietly. I told her about the stretch of road, about the old farmhouse I had seen. She nodded slowly, her expression grave. "You're not the first to see her," she said. "That girl's been dead for over 50 years. She died in a car accident on that road, right near where you picked her up. They say she still hitchhikes, trying to get home, but no one ever gets her there." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "Consider yourself lucky," she added. "Some folks say that if you don't pick her up, she finds another way to make sure you do." I didn't sleep that night. I didn't go back to the cabin. I turned the car around and drove home, never looking back at that cursed stretch of road. I'll never pick up another hitchhiker again. Not after her. It was a cold, rainy night, and I was driving through the back roads of rural Pennsylvania. The rain was coming down in thick sheets, and the wipers struggled to keep the windshield clear. I was exhausted from a long day of driving and just wanted to reach the motel I had booked for the night. The road was nearly empty. No other cars, no signs of life, just miles of dark asphalt winding through the woods. The only sound was the steady thrum of rain against the car and the occasional rumble of thunder in the distance. I had been driving for hours, my eyes starting to droop from the monotony of it all, when I saw him. He was standing by the side of the road, soaked to the bone, his thumb sticking out. Even in the dim light, I could make out his tattered clothes, his wild hair plastered to his head by the rain. He looked desperate, shivering in the cold, his thin frame barely holding up against the elements. Everything in me screamed not to stop. I'd heard too many horror stories about hitchhikers, and I wasn't about to become one of them. But the sight of him, standing there in the freezing rain with nowhere to go, tugged at my conscience. I couldn't just leave him out there. With a heavy sigh, I pulled the car over and rolled down the window. "Need a lift?" I called over the sound of the rain. He didn't respond right away. He just stood there for a moment, staring at me, rain dripping off his nose. Then, without a word, he walked around to the passenger side and climbed in. He didn't thank me, didn't say anything at all. He just shut the door and sat there, dripping wet, staring straight ahead. The air in the car immediately grew colder, like a chill had followed him in. I glanced over at him. trying to get a read on who I had just let into my car. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, but there was something else, something about his silence that set me on edge. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Down the road," he muttered, his voice low and rough. "Where exactly?" I pressed, uneasy with his vague answer. He didn't respond. He just kept staring ahead, his wet clothes clinging to his thin frame, his fingers twitching slightly. The road stretched on in front of us, dark and endless. The rain hadn't let up, and the trees on either side of the road seemed to close in, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. After a few minutes of silence, the man finally spoke. "Ever been out this way before?" he asked, his voice barely more than a rasp. I shook my head. "No, just passing through, headed to a motel for the night." He nodded, but he didn't say anything else. Something about him was deeply unsettling. His stillness, the way he kept his hands clasped tightly in his lap, the way his eyes never met mine. It was all wrong. The cold in the car was getting worse, to the point where I could see my breath, even though I had the heater on full blast. I tried to make small talk, asking him where he was from, what he was doing out in the middle of nowhere, but his answers were short, evasive. He never gave me any real details, just vague, one-word responses that made me feel like I wasn't talking to a person at all, but to a shadow. As we drove further down the road, the tension in the car became unbearable. My heart was racing, and my hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had gone white. I kept sneaking glances at him out of the corner of my eye, hoping for some sign that he wasn't as dangerous as my gut was telling me. That's when I noticed it. His clothes weren't just wet, they were filthy, streaked with mud and something darker. His hands, pale and trembling, were stained, as though he'd been digging through the dirt. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my voice barely steady. He didn't answer. He just sat there, staring straight ahead. "Look, if you need me to drop you off somewhere, just let me know," I added, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. Finally, he turned to look at me, his eyes dark and unreadable. "I need to get home," he said quietly. "Okay, where's home?" He didn't respond, just kept staring at me with those hollow eyes. That's when I saw the sign. We were coming up on a small town, barely more than a collection of buildings along the side of the road. The motel I had booked was just a few miles past it. I decided I would drop him off there. No more questions. I didn't care where he was going, as long as he wasn't in my car anymore. As we approached the town, I turned to him. "I'll drop you off here," I said firmly. "This is as far as I'm going." He didn't respond, but I could see the tension in his body as we neared the outskirts of town. His hands were shaking now, and his breath was coming in ragged gasps. Something was very, very wrong. I pulled the car over near a small diner, hoping he would get out without a fuss. "You can get out here," I said, trying to sound calm. He didn't move. "Seriously, man," I said, my voice rising. "This is the end of the line." Slowly he turned to me, and what I saw in his eyes made my blood run cold. There was something broken there, something twisted and desperate. His face was pale, his skin pulled tight over his bones, and for the first time, I noticed the way his clothes seemed old, like they didn't belong to this time. "I can't go back," he whispered, his voice cracking. "They won't let me." I froze, my mind racing. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice shaking now. He didn't answer. Instead, he opened the car door and stepped out into the rain. He stood there for a moment, his back to me, his thin frame shivering in the cold. Then, without another word, he walked down the road and disappeared into the darkness. I sat there for a long time, too shaken to move. The rain continued to pour, the night pressing in around me, but I couldn't stop thinking about what he had said. Who was he? And why had he been so desperate? I finally pulled away from the curb and drove to the motel. When I checked in, I asked the clerk if they knew anyone like the man I had picked up. The clerk frowned. "You mean the hitchhiker?" I nodded. He shook his head. "That stretch of road? No one picks anyone up there anymore. Not since the accident." "Accident?" I asked, my heart pounding. "Yeah," he said, leaning in a little closer. "Years ago, a man died out there. They say he wanders the road, trying to get home, but no one ever makes it back with him. Folks around here avoid that area. Too many stories of people picking him up and, well, let's just say they don't come back the same. I didn't sleep that night, and I never drove that road again."